Hello, my name is Laurent Ferri. I am the curator of the pre-1800 collections at Cornell University Library, and this is a presentation about Islamic libraries from the 10th century to the 18th century. This period saw the spectacular development of libraries in Muslim societies, and I see three main reasons for that. The first reason is evidently the eminent status of the written word. Every Muslim must read and memorize the Quran and the sacred texts, the Quran, as well as the Hadith, must be made available in libraries. Second, there's the wide circulation of fatwas, the legal opinions derived from the foundational books of Islam by the ulamas, the experts, and while they're non-binding, these opinions nevertheless regulated many aspects of the life of Muslims, including the production and storage of books. Konrad Hirschler mentions a fatwa written in North Africa in the 15th century about whether it is licit or not to store books in a fruit dryer in a mosque. Finally, there's the political dimension of libraries, both instruments of patronage and mirrors or metaphors of multicultural and multilingual territories under one ruler. The oldest catalogue of all the manuscripts in the Arabic language, compiled in 987 by a book dealer and calligrapher in Baghdad, already listed 10,500 individual books on all kinds of subjects, some of them, and actually many of them, already available in libraries. At the same time, the celebrated monastery of Lorsch in Germany had only 600 manuscripts used exclusively by a few monks and their guests, as in Umberto Eco's novel, The Name of the Rose. On your screen, you see the oldest surviving manuscript of the Kitab al-Firist, all the known books in Arabic. And yet, this centrality of libraries in the Muslim world was often overlooked, ignored, obscured in the West because of two traumatically constructed events which fortified the narrative according to which, before the alleged process of westernization of Muslim societies, Muslims were the enemies of the spread of knowledge, the enemies of libraries. The first event was the destruction in 640 of the legendary Library of Alexandria in Egypt. It was supposedly ordered by Caliph Omar, a companion of Prophet Muhammad himself. In fact, most manuscript rolls had been destroyed already centuries earlier by the Romans. Nevertheless, in his Tariq al-Hukama, a compilation of biographies compiled in the 13th century, the Syrian historian and administrator al-Kifti wrote that Omar was responsible, and I quote, Omar asked that all the books that contradict the book of good, that is the Quran, be dispersed in public baths and burned in the bath heaters. I was told that several public baths used books for eating, and it is said that they had enough eating for 6 months. one who listens to what has happened can only be amazed, end of quote. This is the English translation made by Emily Cottrell in 2010. And on your screen, you have a commercial image, a Liebig trading card printed in early 20th century France. Obviously, this is not, historically speaking, a very accurate image. It shows a crowd of Muslims, a mob headed by Omar, burning books in the streets of Alexandria. The second traumatic event was the sack of Constantinople by the Turks in 1453. The desperate attempt to save as many books as possible became a defining narrative among European humanists. The stories of how precious manuscripts were saved from the barbarians echoed stories of the repatriation of relics of saints, made hugely popular in the West by the Golden Legend of Jacopo da Varagine. The Golden Legend included the story of the relics on Saint Mark, brought back from Alexandria, Egypt, to Venice, Italy, in November of 827, hidden under a heap of pork so as to avoid inspection by Muslim customs officers. After his escape to the island of Crete, Isidore of Thessaloniki, the former patriarch of Kiev, discussed the huge library losses in Constantinople with Lauro Quirini, a Venetian landowner, merchant, and humanist. In turn, Quirini wrote directly to the Pope, Nicholas V, the founder of the Vatican Library, that 120,000 volumes, Librorum Volumina, had been destroyed during the sack of Constantinople by the Turks. On your screen, you have a posthumous portrait of Cardinal Bessarion as a book lover and the index that he composed for his superb collection of Greek manuscripts, which he hoped would help to rebuild the Greek culture in Orient after the liberation of Constantinople from the Turks by way of a new crusade. As the result of these two traumatically constructed events, the history of libraries as it was developed in the West, until recently, minimized the vandalism of the Crusaders, as well as the Spanish Inquisition, and exaggerated the destructions made by the Muslims. Even more importantly, Westerners generally ignored the importance of the library culture in the Muslim world. For example, the grossen Bibliophilien, published in Leipzig, Germany in 1922, an excellent history of book collecting from ancient Rome and Alexandria to Willard Fisker and John Pierre Morgan, barely mentioned Islamic libraries. The author, Gustav Adolf BOGENG, only deplored, in passing, the destruction in 1517 of what remained of the Arabic Library of Cordoba, Andalusia, Spain, by order of Cardinal Ximenes. Admittedly, many important libraries disappeared a long time ago. When you visit the majestic ruins of Mer in Turkmenistan on your screen, it is difficult indeed to imagine that this oasis city, located on the Silk Road, was once the site of many libraries renowned for their generous lending policies. Researching Islamic libraries is worth the effort, however, not only because global history is moving away from Eurocentric models, but also because of the recent assault on historic libraries by so-called jihadists or Islamic extremists, for example, in Timbuktu, Mali, in 2012. I'm going to begin my presentation with the traditional library world, controlled by political rulers or by the religious establishment, the very few exceptions were the libraries of a handful of independent scholars, and the book market, which to a certain extent functioned like open-air public libraries. I shall then move to the consequences of new social, cultural dynamics, the rise of the bureaucracy, and the democratization of the books, to look at their impact on libraries. Finally, I will address briefly the issue of westernization using the example of libraries. Let us begin with the House of Knowledge, a model of the state-sponsored public library. The Fatimid Sultans of Egypt had their own huge library, which occupied 40 rooms in their palace. To encourage scholarship and propagate the Shiite faith, they also created in 1005 a new kind of intellectual hub, Dar al-Ilm, the House of Knowledge, perhaps modeled after a similar institution created in Baghdad as soon as the 8th century. According to a court chronicler, they brought to Cairo all the books that the commander of the faithful ordered to be acquired or copied, manuscripts in all domains of science and jurisprudence. They allowed access to people of all walks of life, jurists and others. Some visited the house to read, others to copy books. End of quote. The House of Knowledge in Cairo is said to have contained possibly 120,000 volumes, and even though these figures should be treated with caution, it is an amazing number, considering the size of medieval libraries at the same time. For example, the catalogue of the Sorbonne University of Paris listed 1,722 volumes in 1338. Of course, book is a generic term that refers either to an unbound fascicle or a leather-bound volume, including a number of tracts or fascicles, or it's a book proper, a kitab, with an individual title, but a kitab could be a thin pamphlet, a large multi-volume encyclopedia, an anthology, etc., etc. Also, some books existed in many copies, especially the Quran or dictionaries. In the House of Knowledge, there was a difference between the outer section, open stacks with labels attached to the wooden shelves, and the inner section, special collections, less accessible. But the sultans, while following an imperial agenda, see the works of Waritwati, generally promoted an ideal of education which was pluralistic and meritocratic, that is, open to all Muslims, as well as Christians and Jews. Court libraries were much more aristocratic and more exclusive, but they played an equally important role during the so-called Islamic Golden Age, especially during the first 3 Abbasid centuries from 750 to 1050. Natural sciences, including medicine, astronomy, and philosophy, were done under princely patronage. A famous example is that of Avicenna, Ibn Sina. His dates are 980 to 1037, who became famous as a physician after he cured the Sultan of Bukhara in today's Uzbekistan. As a reward, Avicenna asked only that he be given access to the Sultan's large library, which contained, among other things, the writings of the Persian Dr. al-Majusi. As it happened, the library was destroyed by fire not long after that, and the enemies of Avicenna accused him of burning the library to conceal the source of his knowledge. On the screen, you have the colophon of a copy of the complete book of medical art of al-Majusi, who died in 994. It is a copy finished by a Christian scribe working for a client from Western Kurdistan in 1208. In Ghazni, now in Afghanistan, there was another vast and important court library, this one built by the warrior Sultan Mahmud, who reigned over an empire that extended from Persia to Punjab in India from 998 to 1030. Among his guests and protégés was Ferdowsi, the author of the Shahnameh, the Book of Kings, now considered as the national epic of the Persians. Ferdowsi was tested by the court poets. That's the scene represented in the 2 pages from different manuscripts on your screen. But he eventually won the favor of Sultan Mahmud. A comfortable house was built for him next to the palace, and he was granted access to Mahmud's manuscripts, many of which had actually been looted in Persia or in India. Illustrated copies of the Shahnameh became very popular among the Arab-speaking elites, which partly explains the wide circulation of lists of selected Persian words with their vocalization and equivalent in Arabic. Another example of princely patronage. After the sack of Baghdad by the Mongols in 1258, the Persian polymath Nasir al-Din al-Tusi, one of the greatest scientists of medieval Islam, accepted a position with the Mongols as a scientific advisor. He married a Mongol woman and benefited from Prince Ulegu's belief in astrology as foretelling the fate of princes. Prince Ulegu had an observatory with a library built for Al-Tusi at Marageh. It's in a province of Iran called East Azerbaijan. And the new complex was staffed with Persian, Mongol, and Chinese scholars. With the Topkapi Palace, built after 1453, we see a change in scale. After the conquest of Constantinople, the former capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, Sultan Mehmed II made it the capital of his empire, and he ordered the construction of a new palace built where a Byzantine church had once stood. It became the main residence of the Ottoman court and the political center of the Ottoman Empire from 1478 to 1856. Hundreds of scribes, like this one, portrayed by Bellini, were employed at the Ottoman palace, mostly for bureaucratic tasks, but some of them also copied theological works or literary manuscripts for the library of the sultans. Many of these sultans were avid book collectors. On your screen, you see that the daughter of Sultan Murad III commissioned a portrait of a father seated in his library. Now, a manuscript kept at the Morgan Library and Museum in New York City. Due to the centralization of power in Istanbul, the sultans brought entire libraries to their palace in the wake of military campaigns. For example, after his 1473 military victory over the Turkomans, there was an influx of both armory and manuscripts from Central Asia, and the same thing happened with the defeat of the Mamluks in Egypt and Syria in 1517. A court inspector always made sure that the books that arrived, that were delivered, did not belong to a religious foundation or to a mosque. If so, they were returned to their previous owners. Ottoman sultans commissioned Persian illuminated manuscripts. They also acquired Mughal miniatures. The latter were particularly fashionable in the 17th century, both at the Ottoman court in Constantinople and in Western Europe. The Dutch artist Rembrandt collected them, for example. The sultans also ordered translation from Greek into Arabic. For example, Mehmed II, the conqueror, who, like Xerxes and like Julius Caesar before him, visited Ilion in 1462, proclaimed that the Turks were the descendants of the Trojans. It's a wonderful passage in the Chronicle of Christobulus of Imbros, where it says, "Tos Asianos Hemas," we, the Asian people. And he commissioned a new translation of Homer's Iliad into Arabic in 1475. Another Greek author promoted by the Ottoman sultans, partly for nationalistic reasons, one might say, was Apollonius of Tyana, a philosopher born in the Roman province of Anatolia, that is, in modern-day Turkey, in the 1st century. What you have on your screen is an illuminated frontispiece for a translation from Greek into Arabic of a work by this Neo-Pythagorean philosopher, Apollonius of Tyana. It's a manuscript made before 1480. The Greek holdings in Topkapi made the envy of Western collectors, so much so that in 1687, the French ambassador, I believe his name was Marquis de Girardin, obtained 15 rare manuscripts for his master, Louis XIV, King of France, with the help of an Italian renegade and thief who worked at the palace. Next to texts and manuscripts acquired or commissioned by the sultans, a major source of enrichment for the library in Topkapi was the diplomatic gifts sent by the Shahs of Iran, even during the war between the Ottoman sultans and the Safavid dynasty. For example, in 1568, the Shah sent lavish treasures carried by 34 camels to the new sultan, including a luxurious copy of the Shahnameh produced in Tabriz, Iran. The volume contained 258 miniature paintings and it had precious gems and stones embedded in both covers. In 1582, the Persian ambassadors was present at the 50 days long festivities for the circumcision of the heir to Murad III. On this occasion, he offered precious illuminated manuscript copies of the Quran, the Shahnameh, and the Hamsa of Nizami to the Sultan, the Sultan's mother, and a top official at the court. On your screen, you see the birth of Zal from the so-called Ottoman Shahnameh, now in the Tehran Museum of Contemporary Art. How do we know when a book entered the treasure of Topkapi Palace? In addition to the inventories that we have, the first of which was done in 1502, it listed 5,700 titles, we need to look at the signatures and stamps. The opening page of this late 15th century manuscript on jurisprudence contains a lot of information about the provenance and the fate of a book once kept in the Royal Library. The title is written at the top of the page by the Sultan himself. Indeed, the diagonal annotation by a librarian reads, "This is the noble handwriting of Sultan Bayezid, one line, it is authentic." The red ink inscription praises Mullah Uzref, the scholar who died in 1480 after transcribing the manuscript. The book is stamped 4 times with Bayezid's almond-shaped seal, ensuring that the users of the book would include the Sultan in their prayers, the small round inner treasury seal, the large round seal of Sultan Mahmud I, who reigned from 1730 to 1754, and the oval seal of the Waqif inspector, confirming that this particular book was transferred from the Imperial Palace collection to the endowed library of a religious charitable foundation in the 18th century. One of the most fascinating sections of the Topkapi treasure was the section on prayers, invocations, and magical practices that prevailed for centuries in the Islamic East. One of my favorite artifacts is this talismanic shirt on your screen, made for Bayezid II's brother and rival, Sam, was exiled from 1481 to his death in 1495, including 5 years in Bourg-en-Bresse, a castle in central France, and 5 years in Rome. And I really wanted to include it in my PowerPoint, as doubts, questions are often raised about the presence of objects in university libraries, such as Cornell in the US. It wasn't so much of a problem for Ottoman sultans. My last example of a palatial library is found much further east. It concerns Akbar the Great, who reigned over most of India from 1556 to 1605, and he was the first Mughal emperor to win the trust and the loyalty of his non-Muslim subjects. Even though he wasn't able to read, Akbar loved books, and a way to win his favor was to read aloud romances and epic poems for him. The court chronicler Badauni said he himself was often asked to read aloud for the emperor because his voice had, and I quote, the sweetness and ravishing tones of a parrot. On your screen is a magnificent manuscript of Nizami Ganjavi's Khamsa, created for the Mughal Emperor Akbar in Fatehpur Sikri, India, in the 1590s. The Imperial Library in Delhi had been created by Akbar's grandfather, Babur. Akbar consolidated this library and also created a new collection in Fatehpur Sikri. Overall, the Mughal Imperial Library in the early 17th century contained over 24,000 volumes in Sanskrit, Urdu, Persian, Arabic, Kashmiri, and Ancient Greek. Every author had the obligation to send a copy of his book to the library, which resembles the legal deposit system, dépôt légal, imposed by King Francis I of France in 1537. The special collections included manuscripts such as this one. Let us now move to the libraries of mosques, Quranic schools, and charitable foundations. During our period, mosques were not only places of worship, they were also learning centers and cultural hubs. Before being published, a book was usually presented to the ulamas in the mosque with a public reading. The first name that comes to mind is, of course, Al-Azhar, the great mosque and university founded in 975 in the intellectual capital of the Muslim world, Cairo in Egypt. It is impossible to know how rich the library was before its dispersion by Saladin around 1175, but we know that the university recovered and attracted many scholars, preachers, and students from all the Islamic world. During the Ottoman period, the sheikh of the university was at the top of the religious hierarchy in Cairo, and between 200 and 300 students graduated from Al-Azhar each year. The curriculum was particularly strong in Quran studies, as well as linguistic studies, two academic fields that required vast libraries and a vibrant book market. The link between mosques and book markets was very strong and seen everywhere. The largest mosque in Marrakesh is called Kutubiyah, which means the mosque of booksellers. It owes its name to the fact that dozens of book dealers installed their booth against the walls of the mosque. And even if you don't know Arabic, maybe you can hear the resemblance between Kitab, the book, and Kutubiyah, the mosque of booksellers. Book markets were, in general, located next to the largest mosque, and they functioned like open-air public libraries, where scholars, students, and foreign visitors could spend hours, days, months, sometimes a life, browsing, taking notes, meeting with peers, ordering manuscripts, having their books fixed, or just sitting on carpets and read. Large book markets existed in Cairo, Damascus, Aleppo, Timbuktu, and in the 17th century, Constantinople had the most celebrated and the largest book market in the Islamic world. The French Orientalist Antoine Galland, you see him here portrayed in Turkish fashion, counted more than 120 bookshops in the city in 1677. You also have an image of the Egyptian manuscript of the 1001 Nights, which he acquired at the book market in Constantinople and used for his translation into French of this collection of Contes Arabes, published in Paris in 1704. Galland also acquired other manuscripts and he translated the Quran into French. He was appointed professor of Arabic at the Collège de France in 1709. Let's go back to the libraries controlled by the religious establishment. In mosques, you found both schools, primary and secondary schools, and sometimes law schools, each endowed with their own library Sometimes it was a very small library managed by the muezzin. And sometimes it was a larger library with a professional librarian or a curator. In 1537, the new governor of the newly annexed province of Bosnia in the Balkans, Gazi Uzref Bey, established a madrasa near the new mosque of Sarajevo. In the foundation charter, it was stipulated that, I quote, "Whatever money remains from the construction of the madrasa should be used for purchasing good books, which will be used by readers and for copying." Let us now look at the particular form that the libraries of charitable foundations took under Mamluk rule. The Mamluks were originally young men recruited in Central Asia, Crimea, and the Caucasian Mountains to fight against the Crusaders, especially the King Crusader Louis IX of France. After they halted the Mongol advance in Syria and Egypt, the Mamluks became really powerful and governed these regions until 1517. That they would preserve the Fatimid and Ayyubid book legacy wasn't necessarily in the cards. As Doris BEHRENS-Abu Daif points out in a recent book, 2018, Mamluks were horsemen, and they represented themselves through their stables rather than through libraries. Sultan Barkuk, in the late 14th century, held audience in the istable, literally the stable, or a hall next to the stables, thus Istanbul. However, the new sultans soon began to display their power with commemorative and charitable foundations dedicated to worship and study. It is essentially there, rather than in the palaces, that the Mamluk contribution to the book culture took place in Damascus, Syria, and Cairo, Egypt. On the screen, you have two views of the complex designed by Sultan Barkuk and a ground plan of the complex of the Sultan in Cairo, with the repository of endowed or mobilized books marked in red. So as you can see, the library was only a very small part of this huge complex. Most foundations like this one included a mausoleum celebrating the founder, and someone was paid to recite prayers day and night for the soul of the donor. There was a public fountain at the center. You see the octagonal fountain and well, one or several primary schools, a hospital for the poor, a scriptorium, a place where manuscripts were made, and a library. Endowed libraries of foundations expanded through donations by officials who wanted to gain the favor of both God and his representatives on earth. Sometimes they could have more political motivations. They might be afraid that their library might be confiscated or dispersed after their death, and a donation was the best way to preserve the integrity of their book collection. Ottoman Turks continued the tradition of charitable foundations with libraries after 1517. For example, in 1596, Gazanfer Aga, a Venetian born slave, convert to Islam, who had become the chief harem eunuch and a political advisor to 3 sultans in a row, created his own foundation in Istanbul with a shrine, a fountain and a well, a madrasa, and a library with a curator, Hafiz Kutub. The library was primarily for the students and the teachers, but it was semi-public in the sense that friends of the library and trustees of the foundation could check out some books, but they had to return them afterwards. This is the traditional library world. After the 14th century, new social and new cultural dynamics resulted in new types of libraries. First of all, in order to train the bureaucracy, new libraries and documentation centers were built. As soon as they captured cities, Ottomans opened new colleges. The first Ottoman college was established in Islamic in 1331. Teachers often came with the first books, and according to Professor ERÜNSAL, we must assume that initially, in the early 14th century, books were made available to students on some informal basis out of the private collection of the teacher. Some teachers actually may extend the college holidays to allow the students to make their own copies based on what the teacher kept in his apartment. The situation improved as the sultans endowed both mosque libraries with Turkish books and college libraries with books in Arabic, Arabic being the language of scholarship and the language of the Quran. In the introduction to catalogs, librarians describe the rules of classification and maintenance of the library. The best collection, needless to say, were reserved for the training of the technical and administrative elite of the Ottoman Empire. Typically, according to Guru Nesipolu, the books in Topkapi Palace were partly intended for the education of Chancery trainees, polyglot scribes, as well as the top engineers and diplomats. There was a strong connection between the librarian and the tutors of the pages, the most promising students, trained under the supervision of both the tutors and the eunuchs. Bayezid II, who reigned from 1481 to 1518, founded 2 schools for them with dormitories and endowed collections of books for 80 to 100 youngsters each year. His successors asked that the most brilliant boys aged 8 to 18 from Christian families in the Balkans be sent to the capital, Constantinople, and to the Enderun school, the inner service school. These students were split in groups, sent to the Galata, Ibrahim Pasha, Iskandar Çelebi, and Edirne palaces. There, they learned calligraphy and expression in Turkish, Arabic, Persian. They also attended courses in history, geography, mathematics, music, tax and inheritance law, military tactics, weaponry, fencing, and horse riding. On the screen, you have the left map of Topkapi Palace, and you can see that the main library for the training of the future elites was located in the 3rd courtyard, next to the dorms. To the right, you have a view of the new library created by Sultan Ahmed III, who reigned from 1703 to 1730, and it was built for Enderun. The second social change that impacted the library's world was the rise of the middle class in urban centers. Before the 17th century, private libraries were the privilege of important administrators and scholars only. In that respect, serious book collecting began in the Muslim world much earlier than in the Western world. Charles V of France and his brother Jean, Duc de Berry, were probably the first modern collectors in grand style in the West. The art collections in Paris and Bourges were built in the 15th century. By contrast, we know of several bibliophiles in Islamic land as soon as the 10th century. One prestigious collection was assembled by Al-Harith in Basra, Iraq. Al-Hariri was born in 1054 in a wealthy family of merchants. He became a high official of the Seljuk Empire, and here you see him meeting with friends in a library in Basra. Notice the niche-shaped shelves that contain horizontally stacked volumes. Another famous book collector was the Persian scholar, high-ranking civil servant, vizier, and patron of literature, Sahib ibn Habad, who died in 995. He was a native of Isfahan in Persia, and there's a famous anecdote about him. He was asked by the Sultan to move and settle permanently in Ray, the administrative capital of the Buyids of Jibal, but he said, no, thank you. I would miss my library too much. I cannot do that. Transporting all my books would require at least 400 camels. And they claimed that he would need 60 camels only to transport his dictionaries from Isfahan to Ray. It's true that Sahib ibn Abad was a very knowledgeable philologist and grammarian, and the other image on the screen is a manuscript fragment from a copy of his Persian Arabic dictionary made in Timbuktu, Mali, in the 18th century. A few book collectors were women. The most famous of them is Lubna de Cordoba. She was born a slave in Spain, became the favorite courtesan and secretary of Sultan Al-Akram II, who reigned from 961 to 976, and enjoyed the company of intelligent women. Chroniclers say that Lubna kept thousands of manuscripts in her own private rooms, and that she was the co-creator of a huge library of maybe 500,000 volumes in Medina Azahara, the shining city near Cordoba, along with Ben Shaprut, a Jew. So it's a wonderful story, also a feel-good story that may be too good to be true or maybe not. We don't know what she looked like. Today there are only imaginary portraits of Lubna de Cordoba that you can find online if you Google her name. I believe these images mostly reveal fantasies about, the Oriental woman. In his biographical dictionary of scholars in Andalusia, 1451 entries, 17 for women. Ibn Bashkuwal, who died in 1183, mentions other women who collected books, including a certain Aisha, who he says was an avid collector of books. In wealthy families, books were often passed from generation to generation. The catalogue raisonné, or comprehensive annotated list of all the books owned by the theologian Ibn Tawus of Hilal, Iraq, his dates are 1193 to 1266, contains the mention of a very old copy of the Pentateuch that Ibn Tawus inherited from his maternal grandfather. This discovery was all the more remarkable because most of the time biblical texts were effaced or erased to make way for the Islamic holy text. The practice is known as palimpsest. But Ibn Tawus was a prominent Islamic theologian, and 75% of his books belong to Quranic genres. There's a very rich typology. The Quran proper, commentaries on the Quran, hadith, the precedents set by the Prophet and his companions, anecdotes, sermons, fatwas, eulogies, descriptions of cures and miracles, religious calendars, books about demons, witches, or heretics. In the 17th century, books ceased to be luxury products or scholarly resources for a few imams or ulamas. Why? Two reasons. First of all, Egypt began to import most of the paper needed to make books from Venice, Genoa, and then France and Holland. Also, it became much easier to find professional scribes organized in professional guilds, like unions, who vehemently and successfully resisted the introduction of the printing press in the Islamic Ottoman world. The fact that book ownership was spreading in Cairo as well as Damascus can be understood in the context of the extensive paper production in Europe that followed the founding of the printing press. As a result, says Nelly Hanna, merchants and artisans, craftsmen, began to commission and to buy and own their own books. One shouldn't exaggerate the phenomenon. Private libraries owned by middle-class families remained generally small. In the late 1990s, Colette Establet and Jean-Paul Pascual found evidence of the development of libraries in Damascus in two registers of inheritance records containing 275 very detailed post-mortem inventories made in Damascus between 1686 and 1717. The inventory is a very gendered document in Muslim societies during this period. Jewelry, linen, lamps, curtains are generally listed as the holdings of women. With only 2 or 3 exceptions, books are listed as the property of men, along with weapons, horses, donkeys, heavy furniture, and expensive carpets. It is estimated that about 1 out of 5 so-called capitalists had a library in Damascus around 1700, but 80% of them had less than 20 books in their homes, and only 7% of them owned more than 100 books. 95% of these books were in Arabic. 60% of the books were religious documents, mostly copies of the Quran, Hadith, prayer books, books of popular religious legends. One cannot really speak of bibliophilia at that point, but later, some of the wealthiest merchants in Cairo, Aleppo, or Damascus took up collecting fancy books in the 18th century. They were often linked to international commerce, sugar makers, soap makers, traders of coffee, slaves, or spies. They lived in large houses, such as this one, still standing in Old Cairo today. So you have a continuous trend of democratization. In the 18th century, the upper middle class began to collect rare books, and the lower middle class began to own and even to write books. Dana Sajdi, at Boston College now, uses the expression nouveau literacy to describe a class of men who broke the monopoly of ulama on cultural production, including a barber in Damascus whose only access to high culture was the library at the Friday Mosque, and didn't prevent him from writing his autobiography, which is very typical of the new cafe culture in the Orient. The popularity of some types of books increased greatly in the 17th century. Lives of saints, including Jesus, books of magic figures, and Sufi almanacs indicating the festival days and the time for prayer. Nelly Hanna estimates that the Dala ila al-Harirat, a short Sufi book of prayers that resembles more or less Christian books of hours, was found more than any other work in private libraries in the mid-18th century. Wealthy Mamluks had a copy, ulamas had copies, artisans and craftsmen had copies, but, says Nelly Hanna, it does not follow that everyone who owned a copy of this book actually read it. Some used it to read it aloud in the family context, others owned it as a blessing to the house, but perhaps without reading it ever. It's the same thing with many miniature Qurans, which brought good luck to the family, but were not really used. New independent libraries, not controlled by the religious establishment, were created also for the middle class in the 17th century as well. By independent libraries, I mean libraries with their own building, separated from a mosque, their own budget, and their own staff. The Cornell Library was founded in Istanbul between 1661 and 1678 at the instigation of the powerful Grand Vizier Cornell Mehmed Pasha, born to Albanian parents, who made a spectacular career in political and bureaucratic circles. This independent library, mostly for the middle class, employed 3 librarians, 1 conservator binder, and 1 janitor. It became famous for the quality of its public services and library catalogs, which describe the physical appearance of books with great detail to ensure that valuable copies were not replaced by inferior or cheaper copies by those who borrowed them. Again, I recommend the writings of Professor ERÜNSAL from Turkey. So like I said, the new social dynamics only reinforced the continuous growth of libraries. In the Ottoman Empire, in particular, bureaucrats and capitalists were the 2 social categories that spread reading practices in libraries by establishing Waqf, pious foundation libraries, to each and every corner of the empire, and by funding local schools and supplementary library endowments. Their efforts were encouraged and supported by reformist sultans, as witnessed by the Ferman, that is the executive order issued by Mahmud I during his reign from 1730 to 1754, and I quote this executive order: "The pillar of the world and the religion stands on the value given to culture and sciences, because earning of skills and virtues is provided with the books and treatises. In every town, the owners of waqfs, according to the need, must build and organize some libraries, as well as consecrate books for skillful students to read and benefit from them." So this leads me to the issue of the westernization of parts of the Muslim world in the 17th and 18th centuries. For a long time, a common assumption in the standard periodization of Ottoman history, held that the effects of Westernization and of the European Enlightenment began to be felt in the Ottoman Empire with the establishment of the Müteferrika press. Ibrahim Müteferrika, a Hungarian convert to Islam, gained protection from the Ottoman Porte. His name was actually an official title meaning court steward, and he secured a firman in 1727 to open his printing shop, the first one in Istanbul. With the ambitious goal of eliminating ignorance through the mass production of error-free, reliable, nice and affordable books. In total, between 1727 and 1742, Müteferrika produced 17 titles in the Turkish language and approximately 13,000 physical volumes, which is quite a lot. Besides, Sabaf argues, Müteferrika stayed clear from religious controversies, à la Voltaire, and his secular histories and manuals of geography, for example, this one, could actually serve a very traditional imperialistic agenda, including new holy wars. So he wasn't so much of a vehicle for Enlightenment ideas after all. In conclusion, I hope I was able to convince you that the history of libraries is not, or not only, antiquarianism, but a very rich and exciting field for testing cultural and political hypotheses. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. Bye-bye.